Good morning, everyone. We're still letting folks log in, and we will get started in just a few minutes.
Mute your mic.
Good morning and welcome, everyone, to our CAISO Issues and Tariff Analysis Stakeholder Workshop. We have a lot to talk about today, so it's going to kick us off for a few minutes and note where we are in the process. So we're in the middle of our stakeholder workshops timeline. These workshops will continue through the end of August. I don't have the specifics. The specific schedule is posted to the Weeb website, where we have the public interest workshop on Thursday, August 15th, and our final stakeholder process workshop on August 28th. Once we finish the workshops, we will have an open comment period taking feedback on those workshops, and then we will work on a draft proposal in September that we will hopefully issue towards the end of that month. So today we're here to talk about the CAISO issues and tariff analysis. There's a lot to discuss today with a start in the CAISO issues component, where we'll look at some of the key questions around the organization and structure of the regional organization and its relationship to the CAISO. We will review the options that we had in our initial round of feedback, options 2 and 2.5, and then talk about some of those differences, the board comparison, and other open issues. We are asking folks to ask any clarifying questions during the presentation, but hold open issues and reactions and feedback until the end of the presentation. After we talk about CAISO issues, we will take a break, and then we will move into the tariff analysis section. We'll go through a refresher on our step 1 recommendations, and then go through a more detailed comparison of the tariff for step 2. And again, please ask any clarifying questions as the presentation goes forward. But if you have feedback and reactions, we ask you to hold that to the end. And so I will now turn it over to Spencer to start us with our CAISO issues section of the meeting.
Thanks, Pam. I'm Spencer Gray with NIPSI, the Northwest and Intermountain Power Producers Coalition. We're a trade group of IPPs and marketers in the Northwest, and I'll just do a mic check here to make sure people can hear me.
Yep,
Yes,
we can hear you.
Very good, thank you. So I've drawn the straw today in the, we've called it the CAISO Issues Work Group because the content of what we're working on relates closely to the structure of the CAISO, its finances, its staffing, and how some of that would be addressed in the RO, and how the regional organization that Pathways has been sketching out would draw on some of what the CAISO does today. What I'm sharing today is very much a group work product. So several other members of this work group are going to chime in during the presentation this morning. We do have quite a bit of time scheduled today for this workshop, but we may not need all of it. So we'll see how the conversation goes. I also want to share that where we are on the principal recommendation of this work group that we anticipate including in a revised proposal in September, we're not at a point of offering a specific recommendation to stakeholders today. We are at the point of being able to articulate more carefully and I think clearly the differences between the main 2 options that we're considering for how to structure the regional organization and the form of its relationship to the CAISO and the trade-offs in between those 2 options. So that's really what we'll spend this morning drawing out in a way that's more extensive than what we've shared before. Go to the next slide, please. So first we wanted to make sure to orient folks. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide. This is Appendix A from the straw proposal of the launch committee in April. We are assuming in this audience here today some level of familiarity with these materials, but I did want to make sure that the terms that we're using and sort of the source material was fresh in people's minds. So if you recall back in December, the launch committee released a preliminary scope of potential options for what the group of state regulators who originally drafted the letter to the region asked us to look at as stakeholders. And so this table here lays out, with the help of the legal counsel that we obtained to understand where the likely boundary of the law in California and under federal law exists today, would allow the launch committee to recommend changes without a change in current law and then following a change in law. And so what we've done for this phase 2 of our work to get to a proposal for a long-term, more durable solution, which we've talked about as step 2, is to narrow down this range of options to options 2 and 2.5 for long-term consideration. This table, if you do want to refresh yourself, lays out some of the high-level characteristics that distinguish these different options. And I'll touch on this a little bit more in a minute, but the main thing that distinguishes options 2 and 2.5 from option 3 is the retention of a single integrated tariff for a number of reasons that we laid out in the straw proposal. In both options, there is a new regional organization. The new regional organization has sold 205 filing rights over the energy market portions of the current CAISO tariff. And so the tariff essentially is turned into a shared tariff, which is not the current model of the CAISO, but it is a model used in other RTOs with shared sole and exclusive 205 rights within the same tariff. So we'll be really just talking about the further distinctions between options 2 and 2.5 here today. If you do have questions on the other options, we spent quite a bit of time in the straw proposal explaining why we've narrowed our focus at this stage to these two options, but I'm happy to answer some of those questions here this morning too. Go to the next slide. So within our work group, there are really two overarching questions. And the second question stems in large part from the answer to the first. Should the regional organization be an organization that primarily consists of a board that sets the policy, the content of the market rules themselves, or should it be an organization that formally offers the market services and bears ultimate responsibility for them? And when we're talking about market services, just a reminder, we mean EDAM and WEAM. So the real-time and the day-ahead energy markets, that's what's on the table today. The extension of that first question is the form of the relationship between the RO and the CAISO. There will be an agreement in either event, in other words, a contract between the RO and the CAISO. And so the second overarching question is, should that contract be a governance-focused agreement that's more like an interface agreement between the two organizations that spells out how the RO sets policy over the energy markets? Or should it be a contract for services from a markets vendor in which the CAISO, as the counterparty, is the vendor for market services? And those are two quite different things. You can go to the next slide. Underlying those two overarching questions are a series of more specific questions, some of which we have better answers than we've had earlier this summer or spring, some of which we're really seeking some stakeholder feedback to help shape our own thinking. And I'll go through these primary underlying questions in turn. First, what are the incremental financial costs of options 2 and 2.5 relative to the status quo? As you'll see in this slide deck, there's a certain amount of corporate costs of setting up any private or public for-profit or not-for-profit corporation that are shared between the two options. But there are several cost centers that are distinct to option 2.5 that raise its relative cost. Second is the flip side of that relative cost in some ways is the increment of institutional independence that's gained in option 2.5 relative to option 2. And we'll get into this a little bit more. Third is the form of institutional responsibility that the RO bears in the two options. As you'll see, it's quite different. And a corollary of that is what the actual financial liability faced by the RO is in either option. And then, of course, how that financial liability that stems from greater or lesser responsibility can be managed. Finally is an important question that's hung over our work. We have spent a lot of time naturally focused on EDAM and WEAM as the market services that have an approved tariff at FERC that market participants are deciding whether to take those services or not moving forward. But part of the vision sketched out by the group of state regulators who helped launch this last summer was to build an institutional home for services beyond just the energy markets. And so we've tried to keep in mind, as part of our decision criteria, what this regional organization could evolve to either oversee or to host for new services. And I think on that point, I do want to call on Lisa Torman-Hickey to see if she wants to elaborate on that anymore. And maybe we could go to the next slide, which offers a list of the services that are currently offered by the CAISO beyond EDAM and WEAM. And this is pulled straight from our straw proposal in April. And Lisa, if you or I want to walk through this list first, we can certainly do that, but I wanted to turn to you for some reflections on the evolution issue.
Thank you very much, Spencer. Lisa Torman Hickey, Senior Regulatory Attorney for the Interwest Energy Alliance. Thank you all for joining us today. I will briefly just say that we are very interested in watching and for ways where the evolution of independent governance can continue past oversight of the day-ahead market services offerings to include more services such as those listed on this page. I will let Spencer walk through what those services are, I think, but the high-level considerations we have been discussing include whether step 2.0 or 2.5 would enable that decision-making authority to expand, or would enable complete analysis of the costs and benefits of further evolution of services to include market services beyond the Western Energy Imbalance Market and the EDAM, reliability coordination, and control of transmission. So this also weaves back somewhat into RO governance questions, which we considered at the workshop last week. Does the statement of mission in the RO bylaws and articles which will be drafted include any impetus towards evolution or not? Does it require meetings, for example, to analyze whether further evolution is appropriate or not and the cost benefits? But going back to step 1 or step 2, does step 2, for example, make it easier to evolve into the RO offering more services outside simply market services? Does consider, please, and provide us input into whether contracting between the RO and market participants would further make it easier to add more services, whether the increased staffing, which we note increases costs, positioned within the RO, make evolution to more types of services more likely. Those types of questions are questions that we want you to help us consider going forward. So it is both whether and which step 2.0 and 2.5 are selected as the primary recommendation, and what type of considerations need to be woven into the RO governance to best answer these questions going forward and to enable the addition of services, including the services listed on this page in the future. So that's a lot of words, but I think you'll think about it and maybe ask questions during the day that will help to crystallize these questions and potentially generate some answers going forward. And I think that is what I wanted to say. Thank you very much, Spencer.
Thanks, Lisa, for that perspective. What you see on the slide here is not a series of recommendations for what should be at the RO. This really lays out the high-level services that the CAISO offers today, that in most RTOs are hosted by the RTO or ISO. So we wanted to make sure folks had in mind the full suite of things that most RTO or ISOs do in one form or another. The market services at the top there, ancillary services and convergence bidding, of course, have a relationship to the energy markets themselves. Congestion revenue rights is more an extension of transmission control and the various things that are covered in this slide for the meaning of transmission control under the ISO. I think many of you are familiar with the history of reliability coordination and the offering of that service outside of the CAISO and now inside of the CAISO to many market participants in the West. And then finally, these last two bullets about balancing authority services and RA provisions, balancing authority responsibility is the area that the launch committee's made clear from the beginning would be an ongoing corporate responsibility preserved for the CAISO under its current board structure going forward. So that's not something that's proposed to have the option to migrate to the RO as a corporate responsibility. And resource adequacy is really mostly an extension of state law in California. And given the presence of the Western Resource Adequacy Program, that's not an area that we anticipate would be an obvious candidate for extending that service outside of California. So with that, why don't I turn to the actual core of our discussion today, the distinction between option 2 and 2.5, and we're going to start with what the similarities are. So first of all, to make clear what is on the table for both of these options. They both involve an integrated tariff with a degree of both sole and shared 205 rights within the same tariff. This approach, we've outlined this before, has a lot of merits in terms of the integrity of the tariff as a whole, to make sure the various parts are speaking to each other, and to reduce the administrative complexity and cost of trying to pull the tariffs entirely apart to have a totally separate filed tariff, especially in light of the recent FERC approval of the EDAM tariff as filed. I will say this does not preclude in the future the regional organization from deciding at some point that it indeed would like to have its own tariff, or if that's something stakeholders would support. And I suppose another point that I think is worth emphasizing is that for many market participants and stakeholders, the actual outward functioning of the energy markets under options 2 and 2.5 may not feel functionally that different. The CAISO is in the operator mode in both cases. It's more a question of governance and the relationship between the two organizations. Section 205 rights. This is where the launch committee spent a bulk of its time in the first part of our work this past year. What's the same in both options 2 and 2.5 is the new regional organization would have sole 205 rights reserved to it for the market-related provisions in the tariff. Unlike in step 1, which is under consideration by the CAISO board right now, there would not be a lingering unilateral authority for the CAISO to make a filing at FERC, notwithstanding what the WEM governing body opinion is, or what the regional organization's opinion is in exigent circumstances in those areas where the RO has sole 205 rights. The severing of that remaining unilateral authority of the CAISO is what, in the best judgment of the legal opinion that we got, is made possible by a change in law, such that the RO can have sole 205 rights in management of the energy markets. In the second part of our presentation today, a work group of launch committee members focused on tariff issues will go over some of the residual shared authority from step 1, in which the WEM governing body would have primary authority if the CAISO board adopts that proposal, and the CAISO board would have a secondary authority. Some of that shared authority would continue to exist on a residual basis in step 2 under both options because of the impact on the balancing authority area of the CAISO of the energy markets. And so I'm not going to spend time in this slide deck here this morning on that point, but my colleagues will spend time on it in their own presentation. The 205 rights issue I do want to emphasize is perhaps the primary source of legal material independence of the regional organization from the CAISO. And I think it's worth underscoring that those sole 205 rights exist in both options. Business practice manuals. We are not aware, and we've consulted with the CAISO to learn this, of a dispute among market participants and the CAISO stakeholders about a market-related business practice manual that has been disputed and appealed up to the ultimate authority of the CAISO board. So this is not an area that we're aware of precedents, but it is the recommendation of the launch committee at this point, and we're looking for feedback on this, that ultimate appeal authority, such as it is, would transfer over to the regional organization rather than continuing to rest with the CAISO board where it rests today. Emergency situations. Today, the CAISO board has delegated emergency operational authority to the CAISO staff to respond in real time to emergencies in the energy markets themselves. This is different than a case where the CAISO staff goes to the board and says, we need to change something in the tariff. We need to make a filing at FERC. Perhaps we need an exception. This is actual real-time operational management. We anticipate that that same model of delegation of real-time operational authority to the CAISO staff would continue in both options 2 and 2.5. Again, where it's a case that a filing is not needed at FERC, it's a delegated authority to respond to emergencies. At this point, I want to turn to Scott Miller to chime in a bit on his view on some of the overall similarities, and we've got a couple more slides to hit here too.
Thanks, Spencer. I'm Scott Miller. I'm the executive director for Western Power Trading Forum and a launch committee member. And I think Spencer's done an excellent job in terms of laying out the similar aspects of the two options. I think it's important to emphasize that as opposed to step one, which we're contemplating in the CAISO stakeholder process right now, where primary authority of making filings at FERC is underneath the Western Energy Markets Board. We now call it the Western Energy Markets Board. But still there's a jump ball provision under step one for the CAISO board. Sole selection, sole authority to do 205 filings at FERC, so that we recognize that make sure that we do is in either of these options that we meet what is the absolute required minimum for what I think most people would view as independence of the decision-making process for the market that we anticipate, because independence, I think everyone would agree, requires that in either event, the regional organization board has the sole 205 rights to file at FERC. We'll have discussions about the stakeholder process, and we have had workshops on that that inform the RO on these 205 filings. But I think here we recognize that we're meeting the absolute necessary requirement for independence in either of these two. The question now becomes, is the approach into option 2.0 enough, or do we need to go a little bit further? But here we've done what we think is necessary and to meet the requirement for real independence for market rules and for the RO. So I think these are good solutions. Either of these will be good solutions for meeting that governance criteria for the board. We'll just need to see how stakeholders feel about whether or not there is a need to go further than this minimum criteria. And Spencer is going to walk us through that. Thanks.
Thanks, Scott. We can go to the next slide. So another set of things that are similar in both aspects here: corporate protections for the CAISO. We use this term in the straw proposal. This is not a case where in either option, or really any option, you could imagine where there's an ongoing contractual relationship between the two organizations, the RO can't compel the CAISO to, for example, break the law. The sole 205 rights don't extend to directives like that would expose the CAISO to issues like that would jeopardize it as a corporate entity itself. So violating laws of physics, human laws, financial exposure such that the CAISO might become insolvent. I think it's important to be clear up front that we anticipate any form of agreement between the two organizations would spell out those forms of corporate protections for the CAISO. That does not extend to policy protections, to cordoning off areas other than what we've talked about with the balancing authority issue, which is an important issue. But the contracts would both encompass a set of protections for the CAISO as a corporation. In both options 2 and 2.5, the primary protection for both the market operator and the regional organization would continue to be in terms of defaults by market participants in the markets, would continue to be the stringent credit and financial security requirements that are required in the tariff today. The actual market participants are the primary bearer of the protection for the market operator against their own defaults, and that doesn't change here. We would anticipate that continuing in the tariff. There is a need in both cases for a contingency reserve. We will discuss this further and have a better estimate for stakeholders to consider. But any organization needs some rainy day fund for unanticipated expenses. And that's true in both of these cases for forming an actual new corporation. We don't anticipate the RO having particular capital needs or a need to raise capital through issuing debt. The separate work group on the corporate structure of the RO in terms of what form of nonprofit it might take. The RO would in both cases have the ability potentially to issue bonds at some point in the future, but we want to be clear that we don't anticipate a need for that or recommend that the RO go that route at this stage in step 2. And then finally, there are a set of, I alluded to this earlier, just basic payroll and direct costs that hold true in both option 2 and 2.5. And we can go to the next slide to describe those a little bit. So in both options, we would anticipate that the RO, even as a very, very slim functional organization, would have some requirements for these following kinds of direct costs. Obviously, direct staffing costs, but also an ability to have staff who communicate externally, the necessary bank accounts and CPA and bookkeeping services, some level of legal services, requirement to actually develop their own budget internally, some form of facility costs, even if that's purely in the form of the rental of office spaces and purchase of computers. The 3 areas that are in red here are previewing that those are areas of likely greater cost in option 2.5 than 2.0. We would expect there to be more employees and a higher overall staffing cost. So staffing becomes really the cost center of option 2.5. We expect there to be a higher amount of corporate insurance costs to cover the greater responsibility and liability of the RO in 2.5. That probably is not really different than workers' comp or professional liability insurance in terms of content, but scope could be greater in option 2.5. And then finally, the contingency reserve or reserve account, we would also expect to be higher in 2.5. And so we'll get to that in more detail in a moment. I did want to turn to Evie Call, who's helped co-chair the broader functions and scope work group with me from CalCCA, to see if she wants to add anything.
Thanks, Spencer. I think all I have really are general comments about the process. I'm listening to Spencer and realizing it sounds so crisp and clean, and he's got the slides, that really are understandable and clear, which, I give you a great deal of credit for that. And he makes it look straightforward, but it has been anything but straightforward to kind of come to these conclusions about, what's common and what's not. We are really creating something new here, everything that's being outlined. There have been pieces of this developed across the country with different RTOs, but we're putting the pieces together differently. And in other words, there really hasn't been a clear roadmap for us to do what we've been doing. And we've continued to work with options 2 and 2.5. We had debates over this, should we keep the labels or shouldn't we? Just for ease of understanding, to stay in the same framework that we started with in December. But as we've been working with 2 and 2.5, what we discovered, not surprisingly, is there are a lot of areas of gray between 2 and 2.5. And, I think Spencer will talk a little bit more about the different factors that are present in each of the 2 and 2.5. And they really exist more on a spectrum rather than a black and white 2 and 2.5. And there are also a lot of interdependencies, which Spencer and Lisa have touched on, namely the degree of responsibility triggers changes in the liability and cost for the RO and the RO's relationship to the CAISO. So you might imagine in this working group, we've been going back and forth on various issues, but every time you approach one issue, you have to say, well, what are you assuming about this factor or that factor? And so it's been a real challenge to try to get a clear view given the iterations and interdependencies. And last, I'd like to say, as Lisa mentioned, we've been looking forward as well as looking at the model in front of us, and determining the scope and the shape of the options that we're looking at is challenging. But I think perhaps more challenging has been looking at the ability of any model to accommodate a future vision of the Western markets. This has been challenging both because there are myriad market futures you can imagine, but also even within the work group, there have been different points of view on what a future might look like. And you can imagine there are strong advocates for imagining a future RTO, and there are others who maybe aren't going quite in that direction. So I guess I wanted to shed light on the fact that Spencer has made this look very clear, but this has been an incredibly challenging work group, and the work group has done some really amazing work in trying to distill it down to what he's presenting today.
Evie, thanks for explaining that, some of the background on what you're seeing on these slides today. I think maybe one other thing worth adding before we move on to the differences between the two options. We've really benefited from being able to ask the CAISO a ton of questions to understand what they do today, what they could possibly do in the future, to understand better the actual sources of their liability as an ISO. And so the detail you're seeing here today really draws on from our ability and the CAISO's willingness to consult on a host of questions to make this an informed presentation and ultimately a recommendation to the West. Okay, moving on to differences. So to hit the punchline here at the beginning, in option 2, the CAISO continues to be the corporation that offers the market services it offers today directly to market participants. The regional organization is an external entity, unlike the governing body today, the WEM governing body. The RO becomes an external entity that determines the policy content of the services, EDAM and WEAM, offered and operated by the CAISO. In this respect, the RO closely resembles in many ways the institutional responsibilities of the governing body today, but it has much stronger filing rights at FERC. In option 2.5, there's a shift that is important to underline. The CAISO becomes a vendor of market services that are actually formally offered to market participants by the regional organization. In terms of operations, there's no day-to-day difference there. The CAISO continues to operate the markets, but the ultimate responsibility for them as a service regulated by FERC would rest with the regional organization. In other words, the RO is the outward-facing entity with ultimate responsibility for energy markets. The vendor services contract with the CAISO rather would resemble a sole source contract, and I think it's important to tease out the meaning of that a little bit. So these two differences, these two summaries of the options, really, I think, capture what would be somewhat of a sea change in the function of the CAISO and in the structure of the RO between 2 and 2.5. And that difference would probably extend to future options. For example, if at some point the RO decided to file its own tariff, you could continue to have the CAISO, in this view, operating in a vendor mode. So it's a real institutional break. Even if day-to-day and on the outside, the experience of participating in the energy markets isn't so different for stakeholders and market participants, the institutional form would be different. That last point about a sole source contract, we have thought a lot about and consulted with folks about contract law and what recourse counterparties have if they are displeased with the performance of services under a vendor contract. And it's important to think about here the difference between some set of services. Let's think about IT. If the RO were to take on a contract basis IT services from the CAISO for its own corporate purposes, and at some point the RO decided, you know what, we'd rather take this in-house, that's an example of a function that could probably easily be brought in-house if the RO could raise the necessary funds. But for the actual operation of the markets, there's not another vendor to go to who has the same control room, who has that footprint that the CAISO has today for its various services. And so sort of floating throughout this discussion, the form of contract here is not as fully arm's length as some forms of contractual relationships would be for this core function of the CAISO as the actual market operator. And that fact colors some of our thinking, and I hope that stakeholders can mold that a little bit in responding to the questions that we pose here today for how to mitigate some of the effects on independence of having part of the market services be in the form effectively of a sole source contract. Next slide, please. So digging down a little bit more into the core function of the two organizations. In option 2, again, I drew the parallel to the WEM governing body today. The core function of the RO is supporting a policy decision-making board that determines the content of another corporation's service offering. It is the other corporation that both offers and operates that service to the broader market, and it is the other corporation that bears the ultimate consequences of failure. And failure in this case is things like getting sued by market participants for any number of reasons. Failure would be FERC deciding that the tariff is not being complied with. Who do they audit? Who do they come after for compliance? The core function of the RO in option 2.5 is assuming ultimate oversight responsibility for that service itself that's operated by another corporation under contract. That responsibility encompasses the same policy decision-making responsibility of option 2, but it has greater institutional responsibility. And this does not mean that the RO is converting itself into a market operator. It does not mean that. It does mean that vendor management becomes more of the primary day-to-day responsibility of the RO. And so having a corporation whose day-to-day primary function is to manage a vendor contract, I would say captures, I think, the essence of what we envision, at least, as what the RO is doing for the most part in option 2.5. And of course, the upside or downside of that, depending how you think about it, is the RO bears most of the consequences for failure of the energy markets that I just described, barring some negligence on the part of the market operator. I see Joe Fina's timely question about referencing legislative change. Great question. I think I maybe papered over this. These options both assume a similar legislative change that would allow this shift at the election of the CAISO board today. The CAISO board would have to make a decision to make this shift to enable either option 2 or 2.5. So conceptually, there wouldn't be a difference in the legislative change needed to allow either one of these options, but neither of these options in the judgment of the launch committee are options on the table prior to legislative change. Hope that helps, Joe.
And may I add too that we need to keep in mind that when we talk about the legislative change for any of this, what we're looking at is not a legislative change to enable the CAISO to become a different entity than it is today, but to provide these services and to allow California's BA to participate in the RO markets.
Thanks, Debbie.
Spencer, this is Joe. Can I just take a minute to clarify?
Yeah, go ahead, Joe.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I don't mean to interrupt. Yeah, I was just thinking about this, going back to slide number 8, and the question on whether there's there would be an evolution and whether to include language in the in the bylaws about this, and whether the the assumed legislative change would need to be different if there's a foreseeable future where some of these other offerings would be included, and whether the team has kind of an ideal framework, depending on how the bylaws end up in terms of what that legislation would need to look like.
A good question, Joe. So I think the first answer is we've been very careful as a committee, since the launch committee won't be directly involved in the legislative process itself and the way that we've funded ourselves through a nonprofit fiscal agent, we're precluded from doing that. But you're right that the potential legislative change and the way it's drafted could affect the services beyond the energy markets that are permissively made available at some point to be under the purview of the RO. The area that we've made clear from the beginning would not be on the table for the kind of migration to the RO that we're recommending with the energy markets is the balancing authority services. Beyond that, I think it's a longer discussion in advance of the legislature this coming year. And I imagine Evie's got something to add to that.
Yeah, I was just going to clarify something you said, Spencer, which is nothing in the California legislation will determine what services an RO can or cannot offer. That's all independent. What the legislation will determine is the extent to which California can participate in whatever the RO is doing.
And maybe the final point I'd add, that Joe may add a little color. Having legislation that is prescriptive and sort of tracks what we're describing in these two options is perhaps too granular and more specific than what's needed. Of course, it's the decision of the legislators what to do. But there's a form of legislative change that is simpler and more permissive that keeps both of these on the table. Our responsibility, as we've understood it, is to sketch out a vision of where the structure and services of the RO could go to inform what may be considered next year in Sacramento.
Okay. And just a quick follow-up. So in order to kind of keep up with the different options, perhaps, It is the team, thinking about just creating different, packages for what the bylaws, could look like, depending on how this turns out. So we can just kind of, so you can plug and play, just kind of plug the language in there, depending on what it is.
We're hoping to come up with a recommendation as specific as we can make it, and I hope we get there in September. The more specific it is, the easier it would be to read further beyond that to what the bylaws perhaps should say. We're not going to go through an exercise of bylaw drafting this year. We will have some more detail to share about how we anticipate potential bylaws, the RO being considered in advance, perhaps in 2025. But I think underlying your questions, maybe not so much about the bylaws per se, but about the specific vision that we'd be recommending. At some point, and our schedule alludes to this, we will wrap up the launch committee's substantive work on a recommendation by mid-fall. And a number of launch committee members are in California and active in the legislature in their own capacities. And so the focus, I think, would probably shift then to a drafting discussion with the appropriate folks in California. And again, if Evie needs to add some color there, I'll ask her to.
I think you've got it, Spencer. Thanks.
All right, thank you.
Lisa, go ahead. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you, Joe, for the questions. He mentioned bylaws, which makes me wonder if he's circling back a little bit to my reference to the governing documents. I think that Evie appropriately mentioned that there is somewhat a span between 2.0 and 2.5. What I was thinking of, and this is just my discussion, I think, that perhaps there's a 2.0 plus, which references governance in the future, but we will not put that on paper this year. Rather, perhaps there are high-level principles in there talking about potential evolution. We think that, well, one of the questions is whether that evolution can happen under option 2.0 and 2.5. I think it probably can, but we would like all of the stakeholder eyes on that as well.
Okay, and Joe, I think we forgot to have you introduce the organization you're with, which is Snohomish PUD.
Yes.
Thanks.
Thanks, Spencer.
Why don't we go to the next slide? Continuing down this track of describing the differences, at a more granular level, in the straw proposal, we highlighted 3 areas that were particularly challenging for option 2.5. And we've spent a lot of time understanding these challenges in more detail. On each of them, we've gotten close to, or perhaps arrived at, a tentative conclusion that these are not fatal challenges to option 2.5 being possible. They each come with different costs associated and time required, and those may on their own become reasons not to pursue an option 2.5, because in each case the cost is higher. But we'd sort of left a teaser, I think, in April that we needed to spend some more time with contract lawyers and the CAISO itself to understand whether these were potentially fatal barriers to pulling together an option 2.5, and they don't appear to be. That doesn't change the fact that stakeholders and market participants will have to think hard about the relative costs of each of these. So first, on contracts, there are several dozen pro forma regulatory contracts, regulatory in the sense that they are FERC approved, so they're subject to an economic regulator. There are hundreds of counterparties who've signed these contracts, scheduling coordinator agreements, and several dozen others. There are also several and perhaps more than several non-conforming agreements that are sort of some of them legacy contracts with the CAISO that predated some of the pro forma contracts. It is complex. We have looked at the contracts to understand, are there prohibitions in them that would preclude a potential reassignment of them in the event that the market participants would want to have the regional organization in option 2.5 as a counterparty. We've generally not found that there are prohibitions on reassignment. There's more frequently language such as approval of such a reworking of the contracts shall not be unreasonably withheld. When we talked about this in April, I think our more simplistic notion was, well, perhaps you could take a whole group of contracts and with an appropriate process, consider a reassignment to a different party being the RO. In the same way that like a merger and acquisition in the corporate world would envision that kind of change if a company was acquired by somebody else. As we thought about it more, it looks more likely that it's not as simple as a reassignment. It's more likely to be a reworking of the contracts because many of the contracts cover not just market services, but other services the CAISO offers. So you could imagine a scheduling coordinator agreement having an effect on transmission services offered by the CAISO and on the energy markets. And so perhaps, again, simplistically, you could imagine a need to add a third counterparty being the RO to the contract for market services. And that's just illustrative. There are many different ways you could do that. I think the upshot for our purposes today is reworking the contracts, if it makes sense to go to option 2.5, requires time. It's not a month or two, it's probably more like a year or two. And I'm sure folks here may say that's too short. But I think we need to be realistic that if we're tackling option 2.5 and the RO is taking on that institutional responsibility, it's going to be difficult for the RO to go live in the sense of it having the appropriate forms of regulatory contracts underneath it in short order. It is not a fatal barrier, but it's complex and requires time. The second area that we highlighted as particularly challenging is liability. We've spent some time understanding better, and we will have this written up in a narrative form in about a month in our revised proposal. I guess it's in about 6 weeks. The types of financial liability that would face the RO. There's a set of general liabilities that any corporation would face in terms of litigation, any number of ways that a generic corporation could be found liable. And then there's more specific liability for entities involved in market operations overseen by FERC. One thing that we've discovered in more detail, I think, than we understood this spring is that level of exposure, sort of generic corporate liability, is subject to more specific parameters for market operators in a way that FERC has applied, for example, gross negligence and willful misconduct standards to a lot of the liability faced by RTOs and ISOs. Not all of it, but a significant chunk. The credit standards, the creditworthiness sections of the current tariff put most of the financial burden of market defaults, at least, on market participants. The CAISO has a collection priority, which can be considered basically a lien on market settlement collections, in addition to the creditworthiness requirements in the tariff to protect itself further against the risk of default. So the upshot of that is probably that the financial liability exposure for the regional organization in option 2.5 is manageable. We've thought about perhaps you could consider an outer envelope of contingency reserves being the CAISO's current operating reserve, which is set at 15% of the operating revenue, which is essentially 2 months of operating revenue. In the upcoming budget cycle, I think that adds up to about $38 million of an operating reserve And of course, that covers things that the RO wouldn't be doing. It covers a host of transmission services. It covers a very large organization with hundreds of employees. So it's probably fair to think about that as maybe the outer boundary of what an operating reserve would need to be for the RO. Similar to our conclusion about contracts, the upshot of this is building up those reserves in a single year would probably result in sticker shock for market participants. And so it's made more sense to us to start thinking about building up those contingency reserves for 2.5 over some number of years, depending on what the actual level is. We will have a better estimate of this to share this fall, but that's sort of the conceptual conclusion we've reached. And then finally on staffing, this is the third issue we identified. Of anything on an annual basis, this would be the cost center for the regional organization under 2.5. The way we've started to think about the staffing function at the RO is, as I mentioned, in the vendor management role and FERC compliance. The RO, in addition to having some small executive team, obviously a board of directors and the supporting structure for that, a corporate secretary, at some point, if the organization gets large enough, an HR department, but the kind of day-to-day functioning of the RO, you would need enough people who know enough about markets to perform some kind of regular auditing on an external basis of the CAISO's performance. You would need enough lawyers and, again, market experts to anticipate FERC compliance issues and make sure that what the RO is doing is in compliance with FERC's rules, that it's in compliance with the actual tariff that FERC has approved. We are working on a more granular estimate, and I know folks would prefer to have this here today, but we're working on it. At least an illustrative estimate of what a reasonable size of the RO under 2.5 would be in terms of actual staff size and an estimated cost as well. And that may be in the form of a range of costs, depending on what we decide is a not bare bones, but not too large size to have that vendor management role. And we'll be looking really for feedback in the fall from stakeholders about what is an acceptable level of cost or not. And it may turn out that what we come up with is beyond what folks want to bear for the institutional independence of 2.5. Kathleen.
Great, thanks, Spencer. Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. So just to start, I wanted to thank you, Evie, and the team for your presentation, but also for taking our comments back and thinking about it so intentionally. That's kind of coming out consistently throughout this meeting, so I appreciate that very much. One of the things that's resonating is the contracts. So there's kind of two pieces. I just wanted to surface maybe a detail that I think is warranted is on the contract side, we really do think there's a lot of complexity. So I wanted to echo your assessment that it will take some time to do that. One of the reasons for that is that the initial vision that, as we understand it, the initial vision of step 2 or 2.5 would not include ancillary services and other balancing authority area requirements. And a lot of our our participating generator agreement today bundles energy and ancillary service participation in a single agreement. So I just wanted to note that that's one of the biggest impacts that we saw, is that we would need to separate those out and have potentially 2 agreements instead of 1. And I do think it'll take some time to unwind what is already a very lengthy regulatory contract. So adding that there. The other thing on not so much the staffing, but what would be really helpful for us as a market participant when you provide your upcoming deliverable with this additional information on the estimates of cost is there's the lens of what it will take to operate the organization, which I hear you talking about that. And I can tell you guys really have your eye on what's the incremental operating cost for the RO. As a participant, we need to better understand how that then trickles down to the market participants' cost for participating. So one question I've had is, we pay a monthly scheduling coordinator fee. Is there in step 2, can it stay a single fee? In step 2.5, do we now need to pay 2 scheduling coordinator fees, one to the RO and one to CAISO? And I don't know. I just wanted to make sure that you had your eye on that version of this question, so that when you provide your updated proposal, it's not just about the incremental operating cost, but also how that will trickle down to market participants participating.
Great point. And the implied question there, have we separated that out yet? No, we have not.
No, I know.
But,
That's great.
Kathleen, and suggestion that we try to give some insight into what that would look like. It's tempting to think about this just as a like a GMC cost incrementally to what's collected today, but I take your feedback. It'd be helpful to go a level below that.
It would be, thank you. There's also bid segment fees, so that would be the third prong, I think. And you could probably stay at just that level of the GMC bid segment and the SC fees, at least for our part. Thank you, Spencer. I do appreciate all the work the team has done.
Thanks, Kathleen. Okay, I think we can go to the next slide. So I wanted to wrap up the differences between the two organizations here, and then I will turn to Scott Miller for some maybe closing thoughts on the differences with a comparison of what the boards in option 2 and 2.5 are doing. So what I've covered before in the last few slides is at the organizational level. This is really focused on the role of the actual board too. And some of this repeats what I've already shared in these slides, but we thought it'd be useful for all of you to have it in a single table here on this slide and the next slide. Clearly the RO in option 2 is in more of a pure policy setting mode, as opposed to having ultimate responsibility and vendor management responsibilities in 2.5. We don't want to sell the independence of the board short in either option. These are not advisory boards. This is a step beyond the governing body today. It's a step beyond the governing body in step 1 if the CAISO current board adopts that. Both boards have fiduciary duties, duties of care, duties of loyalty to consider the mission and the objectives of the regional organization as a corporation, and put themselves in sort of a trustee mode in the way really any board does. The fiduciary duties are, in one sense, probably deeper in terms of the amount of finances exposed in option 2.5 and the direct responsibility in front of FERC and to market participants in 2.5. So it's tempting to think of option 2.5 as a deeper fiduciary board, but to be clear, there are fiduciary duties in both options. They both have sold 205 rights. I've already spoken about that this morning. In option 2.5, though, the consequences for the RO are generally greater. And so the RO board would need to be thinking about, and maybe having a hard time falling asleep at night, thinking about bearing those consequences in a way that's not true in option 2. I covered contingency reserves, so that's captured here for unanticipated market-related expenses, not just general unanticipated corporate expenses. And again, to underscore that the ultimate supervision over service offerings of the markets belongs to the RO board in 2.5. It does not belong to the RO board in option 2. Next slide, please. Here's a similarity between the two boards. In neither one are they day-to-day operating or exercising direct supervision over market operations. That's embedded in the tariff. So the market operator is following the tariff, and it's embedded in the contract between the two organizations. Option 2.5 most likely is a public utility. There's a little bit of legal color and precedent to think about whether the RO would have to take the form of a public utility, but most likely. And it is most likely not a public utility in option 2. And so the way that they show up in public and mainly how they show up at FERC is quite different. We've touched on the vendor service contract management as a primary responsibility. That's the case in 2.5. And really the difference is in option 2, the CAISO is not a vendor. They have not converted their market services into a vendor model. It persists similar to how it exists today. This relates the next row to the public utility status of the organization. The RO in 2.5 bears a compliance responsibility to FERC. It does not in option 2. More colloquially, where does the buck generally stop for legal accountability and financial accountability? In option 2, it generally continues to be the CAISO. In option 2.5, it becomes the RO. This extends to who gets sued in the event of a dispute. We anticipate, this is maybe boiled down more than some of the lawyers would be comfortable with, but for general purposes, we anticipate it would continue to be the CAISO, other than some act of negligence or other problem by the RO board in option 2. In option 2.5, it's much more likely to be the RO itself directly, but not ignoring that the CAISO continues to have an operator role. So we wouldn't want to give the impression that the CAISO wouldn't potentially be party to litigation too. And then finally is the corporation the board oversees a counterparty on the regulatory contracts. And we already touched on this, probably in option 2.5 and most certainly not in option 2. Scott, I wanted to give you another chance to provide some color here.
Thanks, Spencer. And once again, you've done an excellent job in sort of laying this out in digestible form. But I think the main point that we've struggled with as the launch committee on grappling with these things. First, it was necessary to sort of ferret out the detail, which, as Evie said, wasn't an easy task to begin with. Then once we did that, and we were appreciative of the fact that we did this with a lot of help, outside help from attorneys, and asking lots of questions of CAISO and digesting their responses. Is again, we know we've done the minimum in terms of establishing independence under 2.0, whereby the 205 rights reside with the RO. But the question is, what do stakeholders, and this is now where we're really looking for a lot of input from the stakeholders, what do stakeholders feel is necessary from their viewpoints? As Spencer pointed out, 2.5 represents an institutional break and relationship and change in relationship with the CAISO. You recognize that there's this, a difference in terms of responsibility. How important is this responsibility to stakeholders? This is particularly pertains to the people outside of California and how they would relate to this market, or their, and how they would view the independence of this market. The other thing that we've debated at length inside the launch committee is, do either of these provide additional heft to be able to evolve to something else, to some other market services, some sort of future of an RTO like entity? Is 2.5 more robust and therefore it can evolve to something else? I think the one thing that Spencer did a very good job of laying out is that getting to the more evolved place of 2.5 will take a little bit of time. If we do envision going to an organization that resembles that more along the lines of 2.5 for the various reasons that stakeholders may enumerate to us, it'll take a little bit of time. We'll probably land on something like 2.0 and then look to evolve over the period of 2 to 3 years. I'm throwing that out as an example, to something that's the more robust entity under 2.5, establishing that institutional break so that you can, as Kathleen pointed out, take the time necessary to do what's necessary to move those contracts, as well as to build up the reserves. So there's this institutional break and that we're looking for some stakeholder feedback on this. What do they need? What do they think is better for their purposes in terms of a market structure? And does it afford, which of these affords the optionality as well as the necessary independence for a market going forward? So that's what we're going to be looking for, and we'll appreciate seeing stakeholder feedback on that. That's all I got.
Thanks, Scott. I see Todd Miller's question. Todd, I covered above that a final appeal process for business practices would rest with the RO in both options. I think your question, it sounds like it's more about the actual development of business practices. We have an open question in a separate work group that Bonneville is a part of, as I know, about what the stakeholder process would look like for things that may include business practices. And then I think there's a second part of the answer to your question, which is, where is the policy staff hosted that helps develop the actual business practices? And that's still an open question here. The next slide I'm going to cover has a connection to that. But the answer we have so far is that the ultimate responsibility and any appeals of business practices would rest with the RO. And we're filling out the details other than that. Anything to add to that, Todd?
I don't know if I'm unmuted, Spencer. No, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, I think he answered my question well. I was really concerned about where the process happens and who's got the responsibility. The RO having ultimate say, so that makes sense. But how you actually get to the point, I think that's been covered. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Todd. Mike Florio's question, has thought been given to the number and functions of RO staffing under 2 versus 2.5? Mike, the answer is yes. We don't have thoughts to share yet on the specific numbers. We did share some kind of anchor numbers in the straw proposal in terms of the number of staff involved in markets at the CAISO today, which is quite large. We're not picturing anywhere close to that level of operational staff because the CAISO continues to be the operator. But I think the short answer is stay tuned. We'll have more to share on staff and size. And I see Lynn Mostoller's question is an analysis of the difference in time frame for 2 versus 2.5 being done. Would it be possible to adopt option 2 with an eye toward moving to 2.5? Lynn, very good question. You've anticipated one of the questions that we'll be sharing in writing after this workshop. We have done a very, really, frankly, not much more than what you've heard today, analysis of the things that would need to be worked through in order to get to 2.5 and how much time that may require. Probably more than a year, possibly multiple years. And that does suggest the kind of possibility that you described there. More important probably is getting stakeholder feedback on the merits of actually getting to 2.5, of course, relative to the costs. But the coupling that you described there between the two options is something we've discussed a little bit. And Kathleen, in which work stream does the structure of market monitors get discussed? I will touch on this in a slide here in a little bit. Our group has thought about what the interplay between RO staffing for dedicated staff sort of on the RO side of the fence versus staff who are on the CAISO side of the fence is, and whether there should be any input over the fence from the RO, but let me get to that here in a moment. We have not thought as much about the function of the market monitor as it exists today. And I may turn to other work group members to see if they want to add anything to that. Please chime in, other launch committee folks, if you've got additional thoughts on the market monitor.
Spencer, I'll just say that we've given that extensive thought because when we're talking about a board whose responsibilities are with regard to the market and the market process, obviously the relationship with the market monitor is a key one. In any event, I think that we envision that the RO will provide some sort of input into let's say there's a market monitor change at some point into that process. I think the main thing is whether or not the RO has some sort of dedicated entity that is in which option as the interlocutor with the rest of the Department of Market Monitoring. But it is something that we've given some thought to, and options within, you know, whether we do option 2 or 2.0 or 2.5. And we'll try to detail that in whatever in our recommendations, but we welcome some input on that.
Thanks, Scott.
Hey, Spencer, I'll just jump in real quick. Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. That's very helpful. I'm not going to make a suggestion on the framework during this call, but I did want to bring it up because it's one of the areas that I saw that was missing from the last paper proposal, and it's a really important one that also informs staffing and the costs. So I can also see the needs for additional market monitoring services differing between option 2 and option 2.5. So that's the other reason I brought it up during this call. So I would recommend adding to your table the market monitoring services and thinking through between 2 and 2.5 how it would differ for your upcoming deliverable. That would be very helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. Let's get to our last slide of content. So a couple other issues we wanted to share about that are a little bit different than what we've covered so far, but also related. First of all, the concept I just mentioned of the two sides of the fence and the RO board potentially having some input on the formation of the CAISO team on the other side of the fence. We do not have a recommendation about this at this point. This is under discussion in the work group. And I guess what I want to spotlight is we're interested in stakeholder input on what would be an appropriate model, if there is one, that stakeholders would support for the RO board having meaningful input on CAISO personnel. And what we mean by that is not a co-employment situation. It is not the CAISO, the RO board, rather unilaterally being able to parachute somebody into the CAISO staff. And nor are we suggesting a granular second guessing of staffing decisions by the CAISO. We have thought a bit about this at more of a managerial level. And I guess one connection I want to spotlight is if there is an appropriate model for a separate corporation having some meaningful input on the selection of key personnel at a different corporation under whom it has a contract for services, what is an appropriate way to make sure that the host corporation maintains ultimate supervision and controlling supervision over its own staff so that it remains an integrated staff? The potential value to market participants and stakeholders of this kind of model, if it's used in some limited way, could be to increase confidence that the CAISO verticals, the business units that are responsible for markets, market policy, market operations, that there's an extra degree of responsiveness to the concerns of the broader West and to the RO, who is essentially the client under contract. What that could allow us to think about is avoiding having to have parallel staff at the RO or needing to move staff from the CAISO to the RO, which has a human element to it, which we are quite sensitive to, and is also an issue in terms of the total cost and scope of option 2.5. So we wanted to present this issue that we're wrestling with a bit. Perhaps we'll come up with a recommendation that there's not a good model to do this. But to the degree that having that level of RO board input into the CAISO management selection might alleviate the stakeholder desire or need to have duplicative or parallel staff at the RO, that's a significant consideration. So we just wanted to offer that for feedback, and we look forward to comments from stakeholders. The second issue that I wanted to raise is under both options 2 and 2.5, the CAISO continues to do all the other non-market stuff that it does today in the same footprint. This is clearly a distinguishing factor from the experience of many of us in thinking through Markets Plus and SPP's role in the West. It's sort of distinct from what a lot of other regions of the country have experienced, although not entirely distinct. What we want to do here is just spotlight that we're fully aware that the CAISO would continue to have a number of roles, and we've just listed some of the NERC registered roles here as a balancing authority, as a transmission operator, transmission service provider, the RC, and a planning coordinator as well. And we are going to do our best in our written product in September to articulate the significance of those various roles, not forming some form of conflict in the sense of the reliability of the power system. NERC has defined those roles very carefully to avoid overlap and a diffusion of accountability. But we've tried to think about what is the effect on market policy development in the energy markets of having the market operator have these other hats that they wear at the same time. And the responsibility of the CAISO to weigh those different responsibilities it has in determining some policies. We don't have a good articulation of how to think about this and how our proposals may address it. I would just share that we've talked about how the bundle of elements of institutional independence that step 2 would embody may mitigate some of the recent and ongoing concerns about the CAISO's competing interests in this respect. It's not just one element that addresses it or mitigates it or makes it more transparent. It's probably a collection of elements that we recommend that may address it. So we didn't want to skip over that issue that many stakeholders have raised in their comments to the Pathways Launch Committee and generally in the governance discussion. And if Scott Miller or others who've thought about this extensively want to chime in here, I'll open the mic as well.
No, I just want to say that we've given this some thought and actually discussed some specific instances where this might occur, where the competing element might occur and how to mitigate it. But we recognize that to some extent it's going to be an ongoing thing, and the more important element is oftentimes this will be something that we may manage through the stakeholder process as we evolve. And of course, as people who participate in the other workshops know, we're envisioning a change in or an evolution in the stakeholder process as it pertains to the RO. But you know, this is something that's going to exist, and the competing aspect of this exists even in an RTO structure, and it's something that is up for discussion in stakeholder groups everywhere, and that's probably where a lot of the solutions for this is going to land going forward.
Scott. Okay, we can hit our last slide and then we're open for discussion here. This slide really just is a reprisal of the questions, the key questions laid out at the front of this deck. I hope the presentation's given folks a chance to think about some of these questions in more detail, and maybe prompted more questions for you that you want to ask. At the end of our workshop today, after the tariff section, there will be a link to a document that captures all of these questions in a formal way, posed to stakeholders, and a couple other ones as well from this CAISO issues deck that we're really looking for feedback. We've got a 2-week comment period to give people some form of deadline, so we gather the input timely. And truly, you've seen a snapshot of where our discussions are, and we hope to get to a group recommendation here in September. So with that, we can move to discussion, and any other questions the participants here may have. I'm inclined just to move right into a discussion period. We could also take a little bit of a break if we want, but why don't we first see if there are immediate questions or feedback from folks on the Zoom here.
It's always a challenge to figure out how long the awkward pause should go, so.
I have questions for myself, so I'm sure other people do too. While folks are gathering their thoughts, why don't I turn to any other launch committee members who want to chime in here, especially on the work group, to provide your perspective or some elaboration on what we've shared. Go ahead, Lisa.
I've always been good at asking dumb questions, so I'm going to ask a simple one. We've talked a little about how we are, potentially trading off, or at least balancing the interests of independence and cost. The initial letter last July was very focused on cost, and we're preserving cost by using the existing infrastructure of the California offered markets. So that's the intellectual infrastructure, meaning the tariff and the operations, as well as the physical approval of FERC and such. And so my simple question is, where does that money come from to pay those costs? And how does it change if we move to 2.0 or 2.5 in terms of where the source of revenues is? Because that may color our views on costs.
Good question, Lisa. The short answer is it's collected from market participants, EDAM entities who are signing up for EDAM have their own implementation fee. And we really haven't gotten to the question of how you would structure a potential cost, mainly because we need a overall estimate of what we're envisioning here. There's a important question about where the GMC is collected today, fees for EIM and EDAM implementation within the CAISO, and in option 2.5, whether that same funding mechanism could be continued seamlessly or not, and under contract to the RO. And most likely the RO itself, at least under 2.5, would need to set up some kind of cost recovery mechanism directly with some market participants. Again, perhaps that's collected under contract through the RO, or through the CAISO rather. But it's a good implementation question. We don't have an answer yet.
Thank you.
I see Todd Ryan, and I don't know if Jeff, Todd, just 1 second, maybe Jeff Nelson wanted to chime in on Lisa's question.
Yeah, well, just sort of more broadly, I thank you very much, Spencer, for the presentation. I'm having a little bit of technical difficulties, but just for emphasis, under both the scenarios, we wind up creating the RO, which is it's an independent, it's probably going to be some flavor like a 501c3 or something. It's going to be an independent entity. And under either flavor of 2.0 or 2.5, you're going to have that board appointed for the RO in a very independent manner. A lot of details to be worked out, but probably no difference in the way the board is appointed under the 2.0 or the 2.5, probably. And in addition, under both flavors, you're going to have, and it's being worked on in another part of the launch committee, a stakeholder process that is going to ultimately be engaging with the RO as it concerns, at least initially, regional market rules. So in a lot of ways, it's going to be kind of transparent to stakeholders whether we're in a 2.0 or a 2.5 scenario, at least how I envision things. Either way, you're going to have a fully independent governing board from the RO that's going to be solely responsible for the market rules that are going to be applied to the region. And under either circumstance, the ISO maintains all of its own balancing authority roles and functions, all of its own reliability functions. So from a stakeholder perspective, there might not be much of a difference in the look and feel of their daily interactions with either the RO or how they engage the FERC process when the RO makes a filing. It's really more of a corporate structure. And then for participants that are part of the ISO's market today, or EIM or EDAM, there may be some contractual differences on who they're contracting with. And there may be some difference in how the amount of dollars that needs to be collected under both situations. So it's likely that rates would be slightly higher under 2.5 than a 2.0 because of some of the lack of consolidation. But it's just something for stakeholders to think about. In either framework, you have a fully independent board overseeing the sole authority of the markets. But that board is going to be appointed through some flavor of independent measures. You're going to have a robust stakeholder process. It's almost a technical issue between the two. So anyways, just for people to consider, it's not like one is going to bring sort of a look and feel that's completely different to the stakeholders than the other one will bring. At least that's currently how I see it. So thank you for the chance to chime in.
Thanks, Jeff. I share that view. One caveat, I guess, would be a potential stakeholder reform, which we've had 3 workshops on, and there's a separate work group working through stakeholder reforms. Those could hold true in either 2 or 2.5. Hosting a stakeholder process could hold true in either 2 or 2.5. So open question how stakeholders would experience the stakeholder process going forward. That's really not necessarily affected by the structure and the form of contract we've described here, which I think underscores Jeff's point. Let's go to Todd and then Kathleen and Christine.
Good morning, Todd Ryan with Pacific Gas and Electric. I heard you say at least twice that the RO board would have ultimate authority over the business practice manual's appeals. And to me, the business practice manuals are a reflection of the tariff. And so I would have assumed that the similar applies to test would also apply here, given that there might be business practice manuals regarding transmission planning or other balancing area authority related tariff rules.
Todd, the short answer is yes. The area of sole authority, the RO, would match the authority over the business practices. It wouldn't be more extensive than that. So the CAISO would continue to have the ultimate authority over business practices that don't flow from a tariff provision the RO oversees.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
You bet. Kathleen.
Great, thank you, Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. In the spirit of Lisa bringing up, there's no dumb question. I'm going to go for it. So here's what is still very confusing to me in this discussion is, in some ways, I read all of the papers and proposals and hear the discussions as if I took a step back and looked at 300,000 feet as saying, well, now we want to create a new organization to operate the energy markets in day ahead and real time, and any BAA that wants to participate would have to opt in. That's status quo for anyone joining EIM or EDAM signing that implementation agreement, but that's not something CAISO has done, is signed an agreement with itself. So one thing that has been really confusing to me, and if y'all have talked about it and can shed light, would be great. So my first question is your vision that CAISO is, as a BAA, similar to all other BAAs, opting in and signing its own implementation agreement with the RO?
Good question. I don't know if I have a good answer for it, but I'll take a crack at it. So in option 2, the RO board is given sole 205 rights that don't exist for the governing body today. The tariff's already approved. The CAISO continues to own the tariff and be the public utility. I don't see that there needs to be some positive action by the CAISO as a BAA to continue to be part of the market it's already part of. In 2.5, I think actually something similar holds, because the tariff's already approved and we're not pulling the tariff apart. It's the authority over any tariff changes moves to a different corporation. I suppose that doesn't rule out, though, that if having that kind of positive action by the CAISO as a BAA going forward is important to the CAISO or to stakeholders, perhaps you could structure it that way. We haven't talked about an explicit, at least in this work group, implementation agreement approach like other EDAM entities undertake to join EDAM. So there's probably some wiggle room there to think about it more. Kathleen, be my crack at it. Looks like Evie's got a thought too.
Oh yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, so I agree with Spencer on 2.0 because the CAISO still owns the tariff. Once we get to 2.5, I think the vision that we've been having is kind of exactly what you described, which is we are trying to put the CAISO BA in the same position as all other BAs who will be participating in the market. So I would imagine that, like today, someone has to commit to EDAM, someone would have to commit to the RO market. And particularly if you imagine the contracts going over from the CAISO, if you go that far where you're migrating contracts, I would say definitely, because the privity now is no longer with the CAISO as an entity, but with the RO. So I see it as a difference between 2 and 2.5 potentially. But I will say what Spencer said, we haven't really taken a deep dive into that question within our group.
That's all really helpful, because as I'm trying to think through this, and even we talked about the contracts, I mean, maybe there is a version of this proposal that all of the participants' agreements don't need to be revised if it's sleeving through a BAA agreement. Just trying to think about how other areas have third-party generators participating. That would be the analogy. Is that what y'all were thinking?
We haven't thought about that yet, Kathleen. It's a good question. Where it's been more obvious to us is services beyond EDAM and WEAM, where the CAISO is not already embedded in the market service offering that's got an approved tariff. So take ancillary services on a market basis. Maybe that's an interesting case where it is closely related to what the CAISO does as a BA. If that were to fall into the RO in some way in the future as a service offering, maybe there's a more explicit need for a decision by the CAISO, but sort of at the edge of what we've talked about.
And the other thing I'll note, and this gets to be a complicated question every time we talk about anything, but what does the contract between the CAISO and the RO look like, the vendor contract or whatever that contract ends up being? So, there will be aspects of that too that could touch on that relationship.
Thank you both. This part has been so confusing to me. I appreciate it very
much. Christine.
Yeah, and I apologize for my camera because right now it stopped working. So apologize for that. But I think continuing the conversation. Oh, by the way, Christine Rock with Pacific Core. Sorry, I'm part of the launch committee as well as of this CAISO topics issues committee as well. And I wanted to just build on some of the comments Evie made previously, which is that just how complex these topics are. And it seems like just about when the working group has kind of tackled one issue, 17 more mushroom out of it. And I think some of these are very good questions. I think, Kathleen, you just highlight a few additional ones. So as we're getting feedback and requesting feedback from all of you on our work products, I think, posing and highlighting some of these topics that may need to be looked at are very important. And I think, to give a concrete example, and Todd Ryan mentioned this earlier, which was the business practice manuals and what's the authority of it. We've had very long conversations around some of these things regarding where should it be housed, what does that look like exactly, and ultimately, while we're trying to really not duplicate costs, the fundamental trade-off is, of course, between independence and cost at some point and what it is required. So we're really, daily wrestling with these details, especially as we're stepping up to looking at some of the costs associated with the options 2 and 2.5. I think it's important to maybe just be honest about the fact that we're putting them into these buckets to help us just tackle the sheer number of challenges and questions we need to sort through, but recognize that there is likely a number of them in between. So any and all thoughts and questions you might have, similar to what Kathleen just brought up and what Todd brought up, is actually incredibly helpful to us, because we're trying to do our best and leverage our personal and professional experiences to do this. But it's a lot, and we don't always agree either. So we have to negotiate a lot of these topics, and it's a very fruitful, very practical, and I think very healthy process. But anyway, I want to just encourage and thank all my other folks in the launch committee for putting in the work, and of course Spencer for putting the presentation and Evie together that makes this look way more summarized and much more clean than perhaps sometimes the behind the scenes work is to that end. So no question for me, Spencer, just maybe an encouragement for people to keep asking the quote unquote dumb questions, or questions that are really mattering to you all. Thank you.
Thanks, Christine. I do see one question in the chat, and then I'll get to Stuart Kelly. Catherine Stockton asked, has the launch committee considered any benefit of separating the organizations into 3? The CAISO as a market operator under the RO, a CAISO BAA that's separate and independent, and the regional organization as a third organization. And I see, Catherine, your note, you're speaking not on behalf of the CPUC in this particular question. We have tried to focus our attention on what seems manageable in terms of the disruption to the CAISO as an organization that with an integrated staff today, and the vision started by the regulators who launched this last summer of an independent regional organization. What you draw out there is one natural direction that you could go with. Well, if you're worried about these competing hats, why not spin off a third organization? Just my own view, and others on the launch committee can jump in here. It's been hard to get to the point, I think, amongst ourselves of articulating what a conceivable second organization that's as robust as 2.5 is, that's still not a market operator. It's a vendor manager. And so coming up with a recommendation for a third group, we haven't broached that in explicit discussions, but I welcome anybody else to chime in too.
You know, that to me seems like certainly something the CAISO could choose to do, since both functions are under its roof. And to the extent there are advantages of doing it that way and separating out, you know, the soft governance of those two groups, that might be reasonable. But again, I think, like Spencer said, that's kind of outside the scope of what we've been doing at this point.
Scott, did you want to help answer this too?
Yeah, I must say, my compliments to you for asking what is a really interesting question. But yeah, I agree with Evie. It would be something that would be up to the CAISO to decide that that's a great way of handling their own responsibilities, and also the requirement to maintain the CAISO BA. And you know, if the CAISO decides that's a clean approach, that's an internal discussion. But kudos for innovative thinking. But yeah, it is sort of beyond the scope of what we've been asked to do.
And I'll pause a beat, Catherine, if you wanted to elaborate any further before I turn to Stuart.
Hi, yeah, I don't have a lot of elaboration. I just I think a lot about California's interests, and I know the discussion often, revolves around making sure California's interests are separate from the other entities, the other BAAs. But I think about protecting California. And I could see where there could be some conflict if the CAISO as a market operator has a responsibility to run the market for everybody. And this is also something that's a current question I have as EDAM is happening, whether or not this RO is formed. But yeah, no, that's a perfect response to my question, and thank you.
Okay, thanks, Catherine. Stuart Kelly.
Thanks, Spencer. Yeah, just as I think about 2.0 and 2.5, my focus is really on the from LA. Sorry, from LA. Just as I think about 2.0 and 2.5, my focus is kind of on the incremental cost, and I look forward to the white paper in September that will outline that, because I'm considering this from a cost benefit standpoint. But one of the things that I was wondering, under 2.5, there's obviously vendor management costs, but given that RO would have the financial liability, what precludes the RO from directly managing and having control of that particular aspect of the service, as opposed to taking it under some form of contract that needs to be managed, and thereby mitigating the incremental cost of vendor management?
And Stuart, when you ask what prevents the RO from taking it under its control as a direct service offering? Do you mean the actual market operations?
Well, whatever the RO has responsibility for. So it's not going to be everything CAISO does today. It's going to be a subset of what CAISO does today. So why wouldn't that service port over directly to the RO as opposed to be a managed service and thereby have to incur vendor management cost, if you will, for that oversight and the quality of the service?
Got it. So if I follow your question, we have scoped this out so that the CAISO, given its investment and market participants' investment in a control center and integrated staff over the years, and direction from the regulators who helped launch this, that the CAISO would remain in an operator mode. And our judgment has been moving operational and all of the policy and management staff associated with that to the RO. That's more like a spin-off situation that has not been what we focused on as an incremental evolution. The option for the RO to take on more of those services itself would sort of be embedded in the contract. So maybe a partial answer to your question is, let's say the RO launches as 2.5 at some point, and it decides, you know what, we can do a lot of these services ourselves better. They would retain the ability to take all of that in-house up to a point. And the point where they wouldn't be in a position to take it in-house is the actual market operations that just depend on the CAISO plant and its market operating expertise. So there's some meaningful range of things. I gave the IT example that could be brought in-house rather than having vendor management. We've, I guess, focused the vendor management discussion on the pieces that expose the RO to FERC compliance and market-related liability. But there's some wiggle room there for what the RO board could decide makes more sense to do in-house as opposed to under contract with CAISO. I don't know if that starts to answer your question.
Yeah, it does. It does, Spencer. I guess there's no real clean break of services. For instance, even policy development, there's still going to be policy development needed for CAISO services versus the RO. Similarly for IT, there's no clean break of services. So it has to be under the vendor management model. That helps, Spencer. Thank you.
Thanks, Stuart. And maybe I'll just underscore the point that we have thought about this as wanting an outcome that saves overall costs to market participants and ultimately to ratepayers. So avoiding duplicating functions or business units where possible is part of the source of the cost savings and building on what the CAISO has already built. So we've tried to keep that in mind as kind of an overall principle.
Yeah, that's where it was coming from a ratepayer standpoint, and trying to avoid that vendor management fee, but it's probably impossible to avoid. So thank you.
Thanks, Stuart. Other general feedback on what we've presented. Doesn't have to be questions necessarily. Why don't we give it another minute here or so if people want to collect their thoughts, and then we'll move on to next steps and then maybe take a break before switching to the tariff issues. Kathleen, I do see your comment in the chat about separation of functions as a way to mitigate competing roles or dual roles of an RTO or ISO. We have thought about that as a potential source to draw from for what we're trying to address here. Obviously, the separation of functions is more about merchant functions and transmission under restructuring from the 90s, but there's some compelling similarities here with the dual roles of the CAISO too.
Hey, Spencer, just because you did raise that, can I add a little extra context too? Kathleen
Please.
from Distra, and I know my peer Todd is on as well, so if he wants to add anything, feel free to. I shared that mostly with the intent, just the flag that we've been talking about and need to do that completely independent of this effort, step 2 and step 2.5. And I think most, or not, I shouldn't say most, a couple of us feel that it's needed in any EDAM future for the CAISO to be crisper. So we've been raising that. There's some presentations. I think PG&E, and this is what you taught if you want to add anything, but I believe you guys put together a pretty solid presentation on that. So it might be worth sharing with the launch committee if they don't already have that, just so they can kind of see. But yeah, I know it's been raised in the context of just EDAM, not even this RO. So I wanted to add that context.
Great point. Thanks, Kathleen. Robert, I see your question. I'll read it for the group. Based on what I've heard today, my understanding is the California legislation won't aim to change CAISO's governance, but will address the ISO's ability to participate in the RO. Given that, will the legislation still need to stipulate that CAISO's participation in the RO could include the institutional break that Scott Miller described? How specific will the legislation need to be to implement the changes discussed today, especially option 2.5? Changes that strip away more functions and responsibility from CAISO and its board. Robert, again, expressing my hesitancy to get too far into the weeds on legislation that we're not directly drafting or directly shaping. I do think there is a pretty plausible, and I'll let other launch committee members jump in if they think it's preferable or not, but pretty plausible legislative route that is permissive and does not get into the specifics of prescribing changes specific to 2 or 2.5. In other words, the legislation could look exactly the same. What would be different potentially in the legislative process is more clarity from the launch committee and stakeholders in support of a particular outcome, 2 or 2.5, that would inform the deliberations, but the actual changes to California law don't necessarily need to be different, and a more prescriptive approach may raise some issues on its own as opposed to a more permissive approach.
I also would add, Robert, I think your question is very astute, obviously. And it's certainly something we've been talking a lot about internally. And I agree with Spencer that the legislation doesn't need to be different to accommodate 2 or 2.5. I think the major question is, what does the legislation accommodate in terms of future visions? And to the extent that we decide to even look at future visions in that context, then that might be some places where changes are necessary. But I think that's, again, like Spencer said, far beyond where we are now. And I would say certainly far beyond where we are in agreement.
Thanks, Evie. Okay, I'm going to move us to our next steps, and then we should take a break. Oh, Sarah, why don't we hit the comment period, just so people are aware of that if they have to jump off now.
And Spencer, I think we've got all of the comment information at the very end of the presentation. So comment period will be the same for tariff analysis, and we were just going to wrap up at the very end.
Okay, so if you're not sticking around for the second part of this discussion, we're planning on a 2-week comment period on the content I just provided and what's going to be presented by Scott Renzel here shortly. And we really look forward to feedback and any clarifying questions similar to what we got here this morning. So thanks a lot, everybody, for engaging, and appreciate you sticking with our workshop schedule over the summer. Should we plan on a 10-minute break here, sir?
Hey, Spencer. I think I'm happy to jump in here for a sec. I think we were planning, because this is such a big day, potentially a longer break so that people can grab some lunch. And so maybe 45 minutes here, 30 to 45 minutes. If that sounds good to everybody. I think let's try to plan to come back around, time zones. Let's see, 11:45. How does that sound? Come back, reconvene at 11:45 Pacific, 12:45 Mountain.
Thanks, Scott.
Rather than asking, I'm just going to proclaim. That's what we're doing. And we'll jump into the tariff analysis at that point. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for the discussion and the great questions. We'll see you soon.
Break a leg, Scott.
Thanks, sir. Did a good job this morning. So those that are on, we'll let folks regroup from lunch and we'll get started in a couple minutes here. All right. Looks like we have some folks joining. I will say there's about 80 folks now. So down from before. I don't take offense. We're talking about the CAISO tariff. It's an exciting topic. I know everybody's interested in it. We're going to spend a little bit of time right now talking about how the launch committee is working through the CAISO tariff. So to start, my name is Scott Ranzel. I am with Pacific Gas and Electric Company. Now you in California, many of you are aware. I work in our energy policy and procurement organization. I am also, like many on the phone already today, a launch committee member, and I have been tasked with working on the tariff working group, which is working very closely with a lot of the other working groups, stakeholder engagement, RO governance and formation, as well as the CAISO issues working group that we heard about this morning. You'll hear a lot of similar themes in the discussion to the tariff conversation and some of the challenges that we're trying to address, and then how to incorporate some of those challenges into the CAISO tariff so that we can work forward with that process. If we can change the slide, let's start with a little bit of a refresher on where we are. So I think many are aware that currently for the Western energy imbalance market, we have adopted joint authority that has been in place and very successful for quite some time. With the introduction of the step one proposal that was provided by the launch committee to the CAISO and is now under the CAISO's current initiative for that proposal, there's a consideration or recommendation by the launch committee to pursue primary authority. What this would essentially do is elevate the Western energy market governing body's decision-making from the current joint authority to primary authority. And it changes a couple of steps in that process, but the key element there is it makes it primary authority for the WEM governing body decision-making. It would then change the course of action about how any disagreements. So it is assumed in that the WEM governing body and the CAISO Board of Governors continue to work jointly and effectively together, and will work towards solutions that focus on customer good and public interest. It changes if there is a disagreement process, it changes how that rolls out. You can see here in the second bullet. Well, let's move to the next slide. And really talks about, gets us into this idea of a dual filing. If there were ever to be a concern that was a dispute that could not be resolved, excuse me, and would put us in the land of a dual filing. However unlikely we think this might be, the recommendation still includes a process to go through that to contemplate how to do it after a lot of stakeholder engagement, regulator engagement, CAISO and WEM governing body engagement. We could get to a dual filing, and it would talk about also what the role the current FOSR might play in that activity. Let me stop there and see, are there any, I want to ask if there are any questions about step one, because I'm going to move very quickly into what step two means and how we think about the tariff in that. This does not change in large part, and I want to repeat again a lot of thank yous and appreciation for the governance review committees that worked on joint authority. They did an enormous amount of effort and work to establish a paradigm that we can move from the current joint authority paradigm to a primary authority paradigm without making a substantial amount of changes. And it is because of that work and that effort that we're able to do that. They're not necessarily the same thing, but all of that effort was provided to us as part of the launch committee, as well as several of the members were served on the governance review committee and contributed heavily to getting us to step one and are thinking about step two. So if there are no questions, let's go on to the next slide and talk about what step two would mean. What does a tariff look like under a regional organization? So again, what we'd be talking about is 2 or 2.0. And under the joint authority that exists today, or the primary authority we hope to move to after completion of step one through the CAISO process, we'd really be talking about the formation of an RO. I'm not going to belabor that discussion. You've heard a ton about how that organization gets formed. But what it does is create a critical change from what exists today, in that the WEIM governing body and the CAISO board are essentially working inside of one organization. Establishment of a new regional operator organization would separate that, and it creates a new challenge for how we think about the tariff, how we think about managing the tariff, how the RO and the CAISO board of governors would be involved and engaged in managing that tariff on a going forward basis. So it enhances our current thinking, but it also changes it as you have this discrete and now very clear separation of entities, and it requires, especially in the tariff, how to get to a clear separation of responsibilities inside that tariff. So let's move to the next slide. I want to start with the goal. It's at the bottom of the page here. This effort is really around how do we create independence when establishing that RO organization for applicable decisions. What we contemplate in both steps 2 and 2.0 as we start are really the idea of market services. This is grossly generalized as the existing real-time market EIM and the extended day-ahead market that's been approved and will go into place in 2026. There is certainly the opportunity, as we talked about earlier this morning, for expansion, and we would be creating a structure inside the tariff that will allow for that. But our initial cut at this really starts to think about the market services that would be immediately offered at the start and how you go thinking about that, and then create inside the tariff the opportunity to modify and change over time. As we all know, the tariff is modified and changed all the time. These changes would be focused in on how do we clearly and transparently clarify for people how the separations happen. So in the first bullet, you talk about clear authority for what the RO would have responsibility for. It would take on sole authority. It would have complete control over decision-making of the relevant matters related to market services. And it will focus on those market services. Again, with the idea that we can evolve to future services as they're contemplated, as we transition through them, and as they become part of the market services offering that the RO might make available to people over time. As we talked about this morning as well, there is still a substantial amount of activity that CAISO will have to manage as part of the CAISO Balancing Area Authority and the transmission activities that the CAISO is responsible for currently, as well as some California state programs like resource adequacy, and I would also include that at least currently the congestion revenue process that the CAISO uses inside of its balancing authority are a few areas that we have talked about that would stay within the CAISO. As we have been thinking about the tariff, the third bullet here, we really start to talk about this idea of there are a few very limited number of sections in the tariff where the launch committee has been discussing, is it applicable for both the CAISO in its role and responsibility as the balancing area authority and the RO as its role and function serving market services should be sharing authority for certain, what I will call common business functions and activities that any tariff would have. Definitions, roles and responsibilities, creditworthiness are a couple of the sections. Dispute resolution in terms of how dispute resolution works inside the tariff are a few. We'll show a list later that talks about it. But these are areas where it is common to be included in any tariff, and that one group having sole authority over the other section may create challenges and process issues for some of the sections. So they would jointly manage these responsibilities, and then it would be further subdivided inside of those sections where applicable and appropriate to identify who would have sole authority over a particular piece. Creditworthiness as it relates to a market service would be the sole authority of the RO. Creditworthiness as it relates to a transmission owner or operator or rights holder would be managed by the CAISO Board of Governors. And we would identify a clear and transparent way to make this available to people so that they understand how we're making those delineations and separation. But the section in and of itself would be managed by both to ensure that there's no integration or overlap challenges that might come about as a result of having these common functions and discussions for a couple of sections. We'll talk more about that in a little while. Let's go to the next slide. So in our discussion, we've talked through what are some guiding principles and how we're thinking about this. So let's start with RO sole authority. So obviously there's a strong desire to create a clear and transparent level of authority for the RO over tariff provisions that would relate to market services. And it would the intent is to encompass all the tariff provisions that are foundational to the operation of the market or an offered service. Again, the idea would be market services as we start would be clearly called out, and then an evolution to additional market services, if and when offered by the RO, would also be incorporated into this process and would not require a redoing of this effort, but would require a transition step that would push something that may currently be a CAISO Board of Governors activity, authority activity, into RO sole authority as the stakeholder community identifies and develops a solution that would make it into a market service, which should be under the sole authority of the RO. So let's jump to the next slide. Similarly, for the CAISO and the functions that it will maintain and continue to manage, it needs to be able to manage those under sole authority for itself. Again, these are balancing authority area ideas, concepts that need to be integrated into tariff and need to be able to be available to the CAISO in order for them to manage the grid, manage the balancing authority, manage the transmission system effectively and appropriately. This is really a preservation of things that already exist inside of that. So it's a separation out of the RO functions and clarity around how that would work in order to facilitate that. All right, let's jump to the next slide. Hold on one second. Sorry about that. I got a dog barking in the background. I apologize. Again, we're talking about areas of overlap here where there are a couple of tariff sections that really establish basic commercial and administrative rules that apply to both generically to the whatever function is being served. How can we delineate those? How can we separate those? How can we subdivide that information so it is clear market services are managed under sole authority of the RO, and that balancing authority area services or CAISO still maintained services are managed by the CAISO. So let's jump one more slide. So as we talked about, what we really want to do is maximize that independence for the RO, make it clear and transparent so that people understand how we can get to this. And in both options 2 and 2.5, we have discussed to a great extent the possibility of carving out a separate tariff and have really landed on the idea that an integrated tariff is still very likely the best place to be for this particular point in time, with the idea that the tariff would get modified and changed over time to get to a more elaborate way to pull out functions potentially later in the process. And I'll talk a little bit about how that might work in a minute. But as many know, the CAISO tariff as it exists today has a lot of activity integrated into it. It is very tightly integrated with some of the things that the CAISO balancing authority would manage and the market services. In fact, many in the CAISO are effectuating some things that are balancing authority area activities via the market. And as a result, making a clean separation has proved to be very challenging, even if you go line by line in the tariff, the 2,800 or 3,000 line items and sub bullets that it represents. Even at that level, it makes it very challenging to go and very clearly do what we would need to do to establish this simple independence. So what we have been discussing is this idea of, many are familiar with the applies to test. And there's an element of the applies to test that also tries to focus on what's the intent, because some of the applies to test activities talk about a specific activity in a tariff section, but it's the intent of what you're trying to change that may provide a guiding example for how the authority should actually work. Again, what we're trying to do is utilize the test, the applies to test with some enhancement to really make sure we can maximize the independence associated with the market service, but not create a challenge around how the market operates today or functions in its current state. And an integrative tariff allows us to do that. Even with the separation of organizations, we can still make it clear and transparent how we go about doing that, and are not forced into a complete rewrite and overhaul of the tariff. It also, as we discussed this morning, if we are integrating, for example, from a 2.0 to a 2.5 over time, as was kind of alluded to this morning, as the tariff evolves, we can be much more clear and transparent about how we are subdividing the tariff into what is a market service activity and or a CAISO balancing authority activity. The CAISO has already taken initiative in this area in some of the work they've done for EIM, where there's a very specific section called out for EIM. There's also a very specific section called out for EDAM, and fostering and elaborating more and enhancing those sets of functionality in the tariff will make it cleaner and easier over time how to see where these separations actually exist or don't exist, and where they must stay maintained, at least for the current time being. And then, you know, if we are to advance, as we talked about in the future, obviously there would be a point in time where a completely separate tariff might be called for under the RO. Ideally, we have been preparing for that over time and effort, and engaging in that over time and effort. So that effort should be easier than it would be today. So let's jump forward one more slide, please. So a little bit hard to read here, but let me orient people so that they have an idea of what we're discussing here. You can see on the left-hand side, this is the currently used set of tariff sections for the CAISO. The first column where it says current state is a reflection of current joint authority and authority that would shift once we move to primary authority via the step 1 activity. That should come as no shock to anybody. That is largely a reflection of what was elaborated in the GRC final proposal, and has been made today, that we facilitate through the applies to test, and the idea of the change and discussion of change in the applies to test that I was alluding to earlier certainly would get engaged into our stakeholder engagement process, and how that would get involved into that process in the future will certainly be taken up in the stakeholder engagement discussion. There's a column labeled shared. These are the sections where there is an overlap in responsibility for commercial or general operating terms. Again, what you see here is a proposed idea and preliminary discussion from the launch committee, not a fact or a final answer. We're still working through a lot of the intricacies here, but you can see there's 5 or 6 shared sections that are reflective of common tariff language and functionality that is necessary to operate a market, a balancing area, a transmission controlled grid. And as a result, that overlap has caused us to discuss the idea of sharing this. Again, things like definitions and interpretations, roles and responsibilities in section 4, you can subdivide quite a bit of the roles and responsibilities into specific authority, but we do not want to necessarily change a role or responsibility in absence of the other portion of the equation having the opportunity to weigh in on and understand why that change is making, and does it have implications for those other parts of the areas. Same kinds of things for credit worthiness and some of the other activities that are highlighted here. The meat of discussion happens in the last 2 columns. and you will see called out in the RO authority column, those would be sections that are identified as sole authority. And in the CAISO authority column, those would be sections that would have CAISO sole authority. Those represent balancing authority functions or transmission functions. The RO authority is a representation of market services and market performance. I will call out and note that in the CAISO authority column, for several of the RO authority items, we have called out specific subsections or sub-elements of a few of those tariff sections. The reason we are doing that is to call out what is language reflective of a CAISO authority item in that tariff section. For example, California's resource adequacy program would not be a market service, would not be a function, would stay with CAISO authority. How some of that gets effectuated in the CAISO market and market activities is identified and called out in the real-time market section or the day-ahead market section. And as a result, what we are saying is the RO has sole authority over the day-ahead market section, generally speaking, but we would call out specific line items and elements of that section that would be more specific and related to the CAISO balancing authority function or something held by the CAISO Board of Governors. Again, this becomes a test of and effort that would be related to the applies to test and may incorporate the idea of intent of what you're changing. If you are changing something in the day ahead market and the resource adequacy program is called out, but it is a market service that you intend to change, there may not be any reason for the CAISO Board of Governors to be involved in that discussion. But if a line item in there is being changed as a result of it and has resource adequacy identified, we would be calling it out and assessing it as part of the decision-making process to understand, does it apply to the market service or does it apply to the CAISO authority when we would be changing resource adequacy, for example, and asking people to make that change in some of the market services sections so that the resource adequacy program would function correctly. And that would be a CAISO Board of Governors decision to be made. So let me stop there. I have given a lot of information and I'm sure there's a lot of questions. And let me open it up for questions. Let me also offer the opportunity to those on the launch committee that have been involved and engaged in the working group, if they would like to add to some of the comments that I've made. I know we've had some heavy contribution from quite a few of the launch committee members, if they're on and able to speak or add to what I've offered up today.
And Scott, I don't know if you can see it, but we've got a hand up from Kathleen Colbert.
I can't, but go ahead, Kathleen.
Thanks, Scott. Really appreciate it. Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I will hit you with a very practical question. My practical question is as far as like comments and feedback on this is a lot to process. So kind of thinking about the next 2 weeks to process it. Is this could this table be made available, if it's not already, in a format either in a Word document or a spreadsheet that maybe we could just make some additional comments on and then submit them as our comment back to you, just for ease?
Yes, I think that it does come from a spreadsheet. We can certainly make the Excel version of this idea available to folks for the comment period. Again, represents a draft really for discussion purposes. So if we think that's going to facilitate comments, I'd be happy to make that Excel version of this document available, and we can add a comments column or some further
Yeah,
information that people might want to see. Great,
that would
good
be great.
suggestion,
Thank you
Kathleen.
so much.
I see that, Doug, you put in a comment in the chat. From the work on this analysis, do you anticipate referring some issues of tariff delineation to the step 1 implementation? Doug, at this point in time, there is not a specific call out for us in the step 1 implementation. We would be continuing to use the applies to test in that shift to step 1. We think that it's still a very effective way to manage and engage it. We've looked back to a lot of past examples of the discussion and thoughts around that, and haven't found an area that we feel would need to do that. But again, if there is comments or suggestions that folks come up with that they feel are relevant in the step 2 discussion and think we should be considering it for step 1, I'm happy to engage in that discussion. I think that the intricacies and challenge with the tariff is immense, and unpacking it even with a few very educated and experienced individuals is challenging. So getting stakeholder feedback on this is really helpful, and certainly will enable us to think more appropriately and effectively about how we come up with a solution that refines our answer. Let me know if I didn't answer your question, Doug, but I think I got to it. Lauren is asking, does the launch committee envision that joint authority is defined in step 1 would apply to sections where there is shared authority? No, Lauren, it's not a one-to-one relationship. It's a shift. So as we go from joint to primary, there is largely no real change, no change that's been called out or specifically identified there. As you go from that primary to this idea of 2.0, the key aspect here is you're creating an entirely different organization with the RO that forces the issue of the separation to get the sole authority, which we are looking for in order to establish that independence. That part makes a lot of sense. What it creates is a procedural and a tariff challenge, the way the tariff exists today. Part of the thinking on this idea of shared authority is really not that we want to, by identifying one single party, it seemed very challenging because many elements of the sections that we're identifying as shared, and that, to be clear, that list is not over and done with. If there are sections that we think would be easier to pull out and give sole authority to, we're certainly willing to have that discussion. This is a first stab at it. But these sections have a commonality that results in the way in which the ISO works today, the way things are operated today, and separating them out and giving them one set of authority with no say for the other one proved to be very challenging, because you could create things like creditworthiness. As you heard in our discussion today, part of the difference between 2.0 and 2.5 is this fiduciary relationship. Obviously, there's a component of that fiduciary relationship that has to do with creditworthiness. If we don't know where we're going to land for 2.0 or 2.5, it made sense to us, and again, not fact, made sense to us in our discussion, that we would share this authority, that we would continue to encourage and enhance the RO board and the CAISO board of governors to continue to make sure that the operations and commercial activities that were more foundational, not market specific, not balancing area specific, would be shared across, and that we would continue to enhance the platform that it exists on. And then you get very clear in the majority of the rest of the tariff, whether you're talking about a market service or you're talking about something that would stay with the CAISO Board of Governors. Hopefully that answers your question, Lauren.
Thanks, Scott. And I'm not sure if you can hear me okay. This is Lauren Tenney-Dennison from PPC. Thanks. That's very helpful clarification. I think I'm still a little confused on exactly what steps would be taken. And maybe part of that is it's still being worked out. I definitely can appreciate the complications that you just shared about how this needs to be approached and some of the challenges. So maybe just to share, still working to fully grasp what the steps are under the shared those shared sections there. Like from a procedural perspective, who would retain the ultimate authority? It sounds like maybe there's a working together. There's a lot of encouraged working together, but I wasn't quite grasping who ends up with that final authority.
Understood. And we've been batting around ideas, and Evie may want to add in on this, but we've been batting around ideas about how to make it very clear how that decisional authority would work. Would it be a cross-board vote, for example, with a majority rule or something like that? Again, that's not a fact. That's not but do we want to do something like that? So there is more to come on that. I think this idea of shared authority, we want to introduce the idea to make sure that people understand why we're proposing it, why we think it has value, why we think it sets both organizations up for success, and then figure out how to move forward from there to make it clear how decisional authority for changes, introduction of the idea gets accepted, hopefully, and then how to make changes for it. Again, these are also sections that really do not change very commonly. You add definitions all the time, but again, definitions or roles and responsibilities, they're going to get added with a bent towards having a market service or a balancing authority function and would be labeled as such.
Thanks. Appreciate that additional info.
No problem. Definitely more to come for sure. Other questions? Kamaya, I see your hand is raised. Apologies if I mispronounced you.
No, you got it perfectly.
Oh, good. Lucky.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So I just wanted to confirm my understanding about something you mentioned about future tariff changes sort of helping to create more separation. So whereas everything is very mixed up today, as the tariff evolves, it will become clearer what is just under the RO. So I wondered if it was contemplated that eventually we could move to a place of pulling out those more separated sections into a clean tariff that lives under the RO, or if that seems kind of unlikely, as the years go by.
We have absolutely contemplated that. It's not unlikely. It will depend on how the organization evolves, not per se how the tariff evolves. But, let me give you a more concrete example. I know one of the things that the launch committee, and Spencer alluded to this earlier today, we've been talking about ancillary services. Currently, right now, it would not be identified as a market function, although many think that ancillary services functions in the market. The CAISO is the only one that avails itself of it. It wasn't identified in joint authority as falling into that category or not. But it has been discussed. I also know that there's discussion around inter-SE trades. If these kinds of ideas are going to go through the stakeholder engagement process and policy development, what I was referring to in tariff development was when we start changing a section like that, whatever that section may be, I was just giving you two examples that might come up over time. We would do a full analysis on that section and say, are there things that are CAISO balancing authority related that we could separate out when we are modifying the tariff to address a change that the stakeholders are involved and engaged in? And how would we write it so that it becomes clear what is the market function, what is the balancing authority function, and are those pulled out? They may both remain in the same section or maybe become two different sections, but it would be a clearer separation than what exists today. And I was using the EIM and the EDAM as an example, right? EIM has been called out, but there is still a real-time markets tariff section. The real-time markets tariff section is also a market function, but it has things in it that relate to what the CAISO Board of Governors has authority over, like a resource adequacy, for example. So you can't just say in its entirety that whole section has to go to the RO, but we would be calling out at a sub level where we think the CAISO balancing authority would be thinking about and as an applies to aspect or intent to some changes that might impact things they have authority over. And the reverse would also be obviously true for the RO. But as you think about a new tariff section and we rewrite a tariff section, whether it be for stakeholder initiative to include it as a market service, and or we're doing an overhaul of a section, we would be encouraging the CAISO to think about how to be more discreet, clear, and transparent about rewriting it so that this separation becomes much more transparent to people. That in itself over time, the more and more we change the tariff as we adopt market services, would make it easier at a certain point in time later in date to say these 15 sections get put into the RO tariff and are no longer necessary for the CAISO to manage. The CAISO may keep the parts related to what the CAISO balancing authority is doing in its own tariff, but you could lift and shift, for example, certain sections potentially sometime in the future. So yeah, it's definitely considered as part of our evolving over time. Excellent question. Kathleen, I see your hand is raised. And then I see there's a comment in the chat. Go ahead. Yeah.
Just very, trying to be brief, but this is really a helpful discussion. I wish it was Catherine Colbert from Sistra. Helpful discussion. Wanted to share with you and the working group. I'm really struggling understanding this interplay of ancillary services and energy, and thinking about the tariff, how you're going to structure it. So appreciate you guys spending special attention to that. There's other conversations that are coming up in the future, like fairly, I assume, soon in the future. And so the timing around landing on this is also something that's really been racking my brain. So like in price formation and enhancements, we're talking a lot about what scarcity pricing changes potentially would be needed to improve our price formation across the entire market, right? But part of that is when our reserves are dwindling. So as your reserves dwindle and you're nearing an emergency anywhere on the grid, how do we want price formation to occur? And so that, just giving you that example, that takes it a step away from traditional ancillary services. What is that product? How are we going to certify you? Which I can see that clearly being separable in the AS section. But when we start talking about ORDCs or things like that, can you just help? Have you talked about this at all? This where it starts to really get commingled such that it's hard to separate it, how you are thinking the authority would shake out?
I think we evolve. The short answer to your question is we have to evolve over time as those things come up and understand where that interplay is happening and how to be clear about what exists in the tariff and how we're going to call out things that are specific to one or the other entity. It is, to your point, not an easy exercise. It is not necessarily a clean exercise. And it will, but again, I think what was established in the GRC and the applies to test, the line by line analysis does not contemplate, and the GRC started it. Several of us restarted that idea. Can we get to it? And it becomes incredibly challenging when you start to think about, I don't know what's going to change over time. So I can't label this line item and assume the intent of what it was meant to be and why it might change in the future and say it has to rest authority in one organization. That's why the applies to test has been so successful in the way it's been applied, is because it puts it to people that are thinking about the change that's being contemplated. For example, price formation. Is it going to have implications on the CAISO balancing area? It may, but the discussion is coming from the intent of what is happening. It has to happen in the market. So I think a large part of those changes may rest, if you were to, cast this in stone today, may rest with the RO authority, but it cannot be an entirely and 100% conclusive answer that we could rest on. And I know that this is challenging for folks to understand. We've really wrestled with, we're going to get a lot of pushback that we're not creating independence. I actually think there's an enormous amount of independence today, and we're trying to reinforce it, but it is not clean and easy and simple independence inside of the tariff for sure. I don't know how to fix that. I'm certainly open to new ideas. I know that many have said, why don't you just, as alluded to before, we can evolve into a separate tariff. If we craft a separate tariff today, it is an enormous amount of work. It is an enormous amount of effort. And it will make it extremely challenging to continue to operate the market and function as a market as it exists today. And we can't freeze that in time and say, give us 2 years or 3 years to work all this stuff out and then reinvigorate it. So part of the reason why we are talking about enhancing what exists today, moving that forward, making it clear about how we would test and think about where authority lies, is also to ensure that within a reasonable cost and a reasonable time period, we can have the market continue to function, have the opportunity to evolve, and make it much clearer and more transparent than it is today where that authority lies. And I think it also engages the stakeholder community a little bit more in how we go about making those decisions in the future. That's really it, bolt on to the stakeholder engagement process, right? Because this is something that stakeholders would be very heavily invested in wanting input on.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And I'll take all this back and we'll submit comments, and that it'll be helpful I think I had envisioned the authority being slightly different under 2 versus a 2.5. And I'm wondering if that isn't a function of the fact that those are still kind of a bit nebulous in what those might be. But yeah, we'll take it back and provide comments that might separate them out, and hopefully that will be helpful. Thank you.
Okay. Other thoughts, other comments, questions that folks may have? I don't see any hands raised. All right, well, if there are no other questions or thoughts, I am certainly available to engage in the discussion. Myself and Tony Braun are heading up this work group, but several members of the launch committee are on the work group and working through it. We're happy to engage in the discussion, examples or whatever folks may want to have as they're thinking about the comment period. And hopefully we'll get back some robust comments and feedback on some of the initial thinking. With that, Sarah, am I handing over to Kathleen and Pam to close us out, or do you want me to roll through the next steps?
Yep. We'll turn it back over to Pam. Thanks, Scott.
Excellent. Thank you.
Hello. Okay, I made it off mute. So thank you all for attending our workshop today and for sticking with us through this very complicated set of topics. I appreciate the engagement and the conversation, and we're really looking forward to your continued feedback on this topic. We have opened a 2-week comment period that will run from today through August 19th. Written comments can be submitted to comments@thewestwidepathwaysinitiative.org, And we highly encourage you to use the stakeholder comment template that is on the Weeb landing page. And the link is posted in the slides here. We do have 2 upcoming workshops, the public interest workshop on August 15th and the stakeholder process workshop on August 28th. Again, lots of work going on, lots of comments for all of these different sections. So we really appreciate your continued engagement and feedback through this process. We will continue on with our timeline as we quickly wrap up the workshop schedule and begin taking and incorporating your feedback into a step 2 draft proposal that we will be issuing in late September with a comment period to follow up on that. So again, thank you guys for your participation. Today's topic was very dense and a lot of information, and I appreciate how much stakeholder comments and feedback we got through this process, and I know we'll get even more as we see your written comments. And so with that, I think we can wrap up for today and look forward to seeing you on our next workshop.